Thank you, Ciprian. I'm going to introduce the guests first. As Ciprian mentioned, we have with us Alina Bârgăoanu, who is not just Dean of the National School of Administrative and Political Studies, the communication side of the National School, but she's also, she's worked with the high-level group on disinformation created by the European Commission for some expert advice, and she's continued her interest ever since, and she's published on the topic and spoken frequently. We also have Alexandra Martin, who heads the GLOBSEC office in Brussels, and she's a foreign affairs and security analyst, also not just a project manager, and she has a particular interest in disinformation, and if I can disclose that, also artificial intelligence and the way conflict and peace are going to look like in the future. And then last but certainly not least, Joanna Rohozińska is with us also from Brussels. She runs the Beacon project of the International Republican Institute, and after years of being a practitioner in the field of counter disinformation and fostering democratic resilience with the National Endowment for Democracy, Joanna has now taken on a new role, which is to support think tanks and NGOs in our region and beyond to advance their efforts in fighting disinformation and malign influence of all sorts. And I think we also have with us Roxana Cojocaru, of course, on behalf of the Future Summit. And thank you very much for all the logistical assistance so far. I will start with Alina Bârgăoanu, and I will, I assume you might have some introductory remarks prepared, but let me just throw in something else, because this is Future Summit, and we've spoken already a lot about what disinformation has been for these past few months since the pandemic started, and for the past few years, but we haven't really looked at what disinformation trends look like, what it might look like in the very near future. I don't think we need to stretch our imagination farther than next year, perhaps. So I will ask each of you to perhaps also give us a glimpse into how you think disinformation has evolved and how it is likely to evolve from now on. Alina, if you would be kind enough to start.
First of all, thank you very much, Oana, for this very kind introduction. And I'm very honored to be here and to express my thoughts on the topic. Regarding your question, I think that the disinformation nowadays presents a very strange, a very paradoxical mixture between things that plunge us into the past and things that connect us to the future. I mean, in the context of the pandemic, I discovered that the topics that the narratives, the claims that were the subject of disinformation were pretty similar to what circulated in the Middle Ages, probably with the exception of the anti-vaccination conspiracies or the anti-5G conspiracies. But even in this context, we could find some references in the Middle Age, for example, related to some extraterrestrial forces. So some very scattered references to technology. So from this point of view, it is scary that apparently these topics haven't evolved at all. In terms of amplification, I think that this connects us to the future. This is why I say that contemporary disinformation creates a very interesting monster, I would say, or a subject, to be more neutral, because my expectation is that disinformation will continue to be associated as much as possible with artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep fake, and technological driven means of amplification. So I'm probably this is pro domo, this is my area of expertise. I do not care so much about content, but the content is very important, of course. But I look above all at the technological means of amplification. And from here, I think that the evolution is simply amazing, because we have just adapted to Facebook, and then we have to switch to other platforms, and then we have to switch to WhatsApp, and then we get all the kind of applications on our mobile phones. So from this point of view, I expect a tremendous type of evolution, again, coupled with very old topics. So I'm very glad to make this introductory remark and go on during the panel as such.
And Joanna, I think, you know, I would like to pick up on what Alina has just said, and perhaps throw this to you. Is disinformation so different after all? Are these only channels that evolve? So are we likely to find it on multiple channels? Alina's just mentioned Facebook, mobile, WhatsApp, and, you know, TikTok, and so on and so forth. But is it the same content? And are we likely to look too much on the technology side and deep fakes and so on and so forth, when the most compelling disinformation stories are actually very simple, and there's stuff like the virus doesn't exist, the virus was created in a lab by the United States, or Bill Gates wants to microchip your brain by means of the vaccine? What do you think?
So thank you, for one, for inviting me, and for two, I much appreciate and really enjoyed Alina's comment about the Middle Ages, because it's true, right? I mean, the thing is that disinformation has always been with us. I don't think that there's anything new. It's the speed by which it gets transferred, and it's the multiplicity of channels, right? So if it shifts by channel, it does, right? Because the thing is that you end up having different means, that some are more personal. And I think that that ends up being the difficult thing, that, I mean, it's the innocent agents that pass on the rumors or the stories. And because it ends up going through personal channels and not just anonymous channels, it becomes that much more compelling for people. I think that's the thing, right? That it's easy to discount that there's, you know, large entities that are spreading disinformation that is very targeted, and that's, you know, if you're talking about the Sputniks or the RTs or whatnot, and we've moved far downstream from that, I think, and it becomes significantly more dangerous because it's much more difficult to counteract if you hear it from your neighbor. And so it ends up kind of like going into the older trends of how information is being passed. Now, if you asked an interesting question at the beginning in terms of like the evolution of it. And it's also, we have to be careful about the terminology that we're using. So if you're talking about disinformation that's targeted, that's malign, that's planted, and that's part of a larger campaign, that's one thing, right? I mean, that is an intelligence operation that has to be treated a little bit differently. What we saw in this pandemic, if you want, is that merging with a lot of very natural fears, right? In climates of uncertainty, in climates where there aren't clear answers. You know, it's easy to blame governments for not having clear communication strategies, for example, for the virus. But if you're dealing with a huge unknown, then it's really difficult to come up with a very firm and direct answer at every turn if you've got a mutating situation. So, you know, it ended up being a little bit the perfect storm. But if you're talking about what we, particularly the Beacon project, but some of the other projects that we were working at, say like 5-6 years ago, when there was a growing awareness that there were targeted disinformation campaigns, right? That brought up also local topics and local concerns, but that still ended up being weaved into a larger web of undermining trust in, for example, institutions. It has kind of like borne fruit several years down the line in the sense that there has been a growing distrust to mainstream media. There has been a growing distrust to government communications, right? There has been a growing mistrust in all of these things that creates like much more fertile ground for any kind of garbage that you want to pass through, quite frankly, because if you don't believe in anything and you believe that everybody's lying to you, well, then obviously everything's possible and you can pass around any kind of disinformation that you want, and whether it's targeted or not. I mean, it just gives much more space for this kind of like organic growth of doubt, if you want. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question greatly, but I think that at this point it becomes a lot more difficult to try and catch out these different narratives. And I think that might not be a very popular thought, but in terms of debunking disinformation, we've seen it's of limited impact, unfortunately, because the horse has already left the barn, as it were, right? So like once you actually have this information out there, bringing it back in with facts is quite difficult, because who's the honest broker? So who's telling you that it's a fact? And do you trust the person who's telling you that it's a fact? And that becomes a much more slipperier topic. So in a way, it's going to be a challenge moving forward to try and reinstate trust in certain actors as the honest brokers who are going to tell you the truth, and to try and sort that back out. And I mean, it ends up being very different from society to society as to how you're going to reinstate that trust, and whether it's in the media entities, whether it's in creating some kind of transparent and recognized standards by which people can kind of believe what the television, for example, is telling them again. And I'm not sure if we're not beyond that. The other thing is that you do have so many different channels of information that it's really difficult to find the best one, right? You're kind of having to parse out who your specific audience is, and then trying to confront disinformation that's flowing those ways. So I think it's just become, insofar as it was always kind of a octopus, it's become, how would you say, a multipede, perhaps, right? If you're kind of trying to figure out the different arms of the disinformation. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And Alexandra, let me pick your brain on this side of things as well, which is, Joanna was saying there's so many narratives and there's so little trust in what used to be the official carriers of information and opinion, whether it's state institutions or mainstream media. And I can confirm that because we've carried out focus groups at Global Focus Center doing our projects on disinformation, and we found that people's opinions are very much shaped by social media. Many of them were unable to name mainstream media where they had seen the narratives that they were believing. They all basically responded, well, somewhere in one of the Facebook groups that I'm part of, or my friends were discussing this on social media. Does it seem to you like with that like everything's moving on into the social media terrain, or is this just a part of the whole landscape?
Thank you, Oana, and I'm really, really glad to be joining you, and thank you to Priyan for this awesome initiative. That's probably the $1 million question, Oana, on trust. And I wouldn't say just the carriers of the message, but trust in general between each other, between societies, between people, between governors, those that govern and those that are governed, and so on and so forth. And I think that this is the major trial for how our democracy will look like in the future. How do we restore a social contract that is driven by trust, and where we all have the same understanding of what facts are and what are those rules that we are all embarking or respecting. But I want you to merge that with what you asked before in terms of the evolution of disinformation and trends, and also further implications beyond just the narratives that are spread and promoted. So we have seen the impact of the proliferation of disinformation, conspiracy theories, hate speech, and so on before the COVID-19. And if we look at 2015, the migration crisis, we have a great example or a test to analyze. But in my perspective, and also my colleagues at GLOBSEC that do research exactly on it, COVID-19 was a game changer in the sense that human lives were at stake this time. And there is data showing that at least 800 human lives were lost in the first 3 months of the pandemic this year because of disinformation narratives. So this is a game changer where we have actually direct consequences, not just in terms of our economy or in terms of destruction of goods and properties, as the towers, the 5G towers in the UK and elsewhere, but actually where human lives are at stake. And this will continue to evolve, given that, I don't know, only 40% of people in Slovakia or 1/3 of the Romanians are actually pro-vaccine when a COVID-19 vaccine will show up. So what will happen when we will have a medical solution? But because of the anti-vax movement, our citizens won't be willing to contribute to the public health. Now, this leads me to how much of a role has big tech and emerging technologies in this. And I hear a lot of voices saying, oh, it's all about regulation and it's the fault of the digital platforms of the big tech. But I tend to believe that that's not the full story. And I think that while there is a very big share of responsibilities of big tech in allowing the narratives to spread, to be promoted, we have to look at what are the grounds where people believe a certain narrative or a certain conspiracy theories. And I want to link that to the quality of democracy, the quality of our governance systems, and the trust in public institutions, and the social inequality. And I think that Black Lives Matter is one of the biggest examples worldwide, at least in what we consider democratic states, on how social inequality actually started this movement of challenging the institutions and actually some of the norms, also on the positive and on the negative sides. And you mentioned that I have a passion for AI and how this will affect conflict in the future. So on the tech side, we are still navigating a lawless web at the end of the day. We don't have an overarching regulatory framework on, let's say, the transatlantic community. And there are a lot of efforts, including the European Digital Act currently, the Code of Conduct on disinformation, the newly formed European Parliament Committee on fighting disinformation. However, we are not there yet. And so far, the digital platforms are the ones that have their own policies in place. And those policies are often not coordinated nor harmonized. And we also see visible discrepancies between big markets with also major languages such as English or French, and then smaller markets with languages that have specifics, such as Romania or Slovakia, Central and Eastern Europe in particular, where the attention is not as significant as in others. So what does that mean when the big tech is not having an overarching regulatory and ethical framework? Is that the big platforms are the content creators. And we know, or I hope everybody knows, how the algorithm works. What algorithms do, they index content and then they provide suggestions that actually contribute to the creation of an echo chamber. The more you spend on a certain message or narrative or ad, the more similar types of messages you will receive. But that comes also with who is deciding what is a problematic content. And that's back to Joanna's point on what is true and what is not. And then the second aspect of it that is very little studies is the creation or the transfer of social biases into algorithm biases beyond just for consumer manipulation. And this is where the nefarious actors are playing or have the opportunity to play on our weaknesses, on our social polarization, and on our fears, on our people's fears. So if we create additional polarization and chaos without having someone to say, okay, these are the ethical or the red lines, and we leave it to individuals or to businesses that have other type of motivation that is driven by economic gains in most of the cases, then we are quite screwed unless we do something, and unless we create a framework that has the norms and values that we believe in as democracies and as transatlantic community at the forefront. And maybe I want to end this part with the aspect of the economics of disinformation and bring you some data in there. Because the algorithms were developed to support businesses. Yeah, it's through ads that, I don't know, in 2019, Facebook revenue, 98.5% of Facebook's revenue was from ads, amounting to $70.7 billion. And according to Global Disinformation Index, approximately $235 million worth of advertising ended up in 20,000 domains flagged for disinformation. So who is responsible for that, and who has the capability or the instruments for A, prosecution, and B, protection of our societies from these types of actors? There will be much more to say on who is behind these economic models, and we have the regular companies, but then we have the state-sponsored disinformation, and then we have the satellite type of actors that are just the middlemen. But happy to develop further in a second round. But what I would like to end up is that the future of our democracies is the key question when it comes also to disinformation. And disinformation is just one side of the equation. We need much more, and we need to really have a conversation on what we are expecting from our social contract moving forward.
But Alexandra, thank you for this, and let me pick up on the last thing you said, and be the devil's advocate for a moment here. Arguably, democracy itself can create further polarization. Political analysts will tell you the two-party system in the US, in the UK, for instance, tends to create polarization. So I will throw this question to all of you, and that is this something that we can either regulate or constrain in some other way? Are we failing? And when I say we, I mean we as a society, we as institutions, governments, supranational institutions like the European Union, or perhaps even NATO, because we mentioned third-party actors that are taking advantage or even actively promoting this. Are we all failing in doing something better? Or is it just a phenomenon that is phenomenally new and then very difficult to wrap our minds around?
Maybe I'll start the first, as I was the last to open the Pandora box. We are failing at understanding the new relationship or the evolving state of relationship between those that are governed and those that are governing. And we could have an analysis of a two-party system, plurality, whatever else. That's not the point of the design of our governance system per se, in terms of how many parties or how we elect our representatives. I think it's more a question of, are those elected representing a majority? Do they have the trust of the people? Do people feel that they are included in the policy making, the political making process? Is the system equitable and inclusive and representative? And whether or not the gap between those that are governed and those that are governing is actually shrinking or is actually extending, and you feel that there are two classes, those that are there, the political elites that have no contact with the reality, and those who actually need to deal with the reality of an unequal social system or poverty or discrimination or anything else on a daily basis. And I think that that's where the key of understanding how this new social contract will look like in an era where information is public, where connectivity is an instant, and it's global at the end of the day. And these are of course my views, but I think that it's a matter of how we relate to each other in this process, rather than how many parties we have available as a choice.
Alina, Joanna, let me look to you for more insight, and continue to play the devil's advocate by saying to what Alexandra has just commented, that if we look at the US elections, it's plainly clear that probably half of the country, the one that's voted for Donald Trump, does not trust the newly elected president. So we do have a very clear case of lack of trust from the people to their representatives. We have structural problems. So how do we fight these structural problems, or do we fight disinformation itself?
my very short answer is yes. Let me very briefly pick up on the previous very interesting conversation by saying two things, and then I'll go to the issue of polarization again very briefly. Another technological trend is that the whole discussion about mainstream media and social media has moved now inside social media themselves. So now we are talking about mainstream social media such as Facebook and alternative social media that have witnessed a surge, especially in the context of US elections. So I would add to the first question these new technological trends that there are mainstream social media and fringe or alternative social media, and apparently the latter are on the rise. Also, let me pick on what was very briefly addressed, and I very much agree with this idea, and I also addressed it to Facebook itself. There is a huge discrepancies between big markets and international languages in terms of fact-checking, flagging the content, and what is happening in small countries such as Romania and Central and Eastern Europe in general. I think that this is a huge problem. I do not see in Romania a similar effort in the case of presidential elections, or to leave politics aside in the case of a more serious problem such as COVID. So from this point of view, I think that if we rely on Facebook to do something about such smaller markets in terms of size and in terms of languages, probably we will go on like this like forever. And in my capacity, I'm trying to raise awareness about this discrepancy about an English-speaking public space and a non-speaking public space such as the Romanian one. Thank you very much, Oana, for bringing this topic of polarization to our discussion. And regarding this, let me say a few things. I think that the type of polarization that we are witnessing today is different from what we understand by legitimate polarization. I think that somehow polarization around topics is legitimate to democracy. I mean, we don't have to agree on everything. But I think that the kind of polarization that was enhanced by social media is polarization about everything. I mean, no matter what the topic is, we have a very predictable and open stand. I mean, if I say that I go to yoga classes, immediately my social and my political and my electoral preferences are in the open. So I think that we are witnessing a completely new type of polarization, which is again not on policy, but on identity and pretty much on everything. And I think there are deep causes, there are structural causes for this. One structural cause is, of course, the socio-economic inequalities, but I think that the technological factor is also involved, because what the technology behind platforms, what big data and what algorithms create, they create identities. And this is why once people are kept in a filter bubble, for example, they create a very strong identity, very strong affiliation to that kind of filter bubble. And it is very difficult to change their minds, because usually by persuasion, we meant changing people's opinions. But in social media, it is not opinions that are created, but it is identities that are created. And this is why the persuasion efforts are so big. And again, I would end this part of our conversation with the idea that, again, I don't think that we have to agree on everything, but I think that we have to agree on a certain amount of facts. Let me quote from the recent interview from President Obama that was aired recently, that it is very difficult to function in a democracy if we operate on a completely different set of facts. So I think that we have to agree on a certain amount of facts, what is a fact and what is a pseudo fact. We also have to agree on some interests in a very rational manner. And also we don't have to agree on policy, but finally we have to agree on the idea that we have to have civil discourse about policy actions. So I think what has widely deteriorated for the past few years is this ability to agree on facts, and also this ability to agree to have civil discourse on different policy directions and even outcomes. But again, thank you very much for bringing this topic to our discussion, because I think it goes to the heart of the discussion about disinformation.
Thank you. And Joanna, who is supposed to make us agree, or to persuade us to agree, because as citizens, we don't have to agree with anything. I don't have to agree with anything you say. So, who are the voices and why are they missing if they are, who are supposed to be moderating this dialogue?
So you raised a number of interesting questions, I think, and it's in this one thing that Alexandra said struck me, is that what we seem to have lost is that we seem to have lost a degree of consensus as to what our common rules are, right? And what the rules of engagement are. Alina mentioned it as well, but the art of respective disagreement seems to have disappeared. And so it's a little bit kind of a trick to see where we get that back, right? I mean, the thing is that we can't function as societies as simple individuals, right? There has to be a degree of compromise in order for this to function, right? And as they say, politics is always the art of the compromise. And I think kind of like unwinding a few of the things that you said, and so I agree with Alina. So polarization has kind of traditionally always been thought to be political polarization based on some kind of divergent ideologies. Ideologies seem to have gone by the wayside, and instead you have these masses of multiple different issues that end up congealing, if you want, into disparate sets of people, right? And so, one of the interesting things is that if you look, for example, of supporters of, I won't say, because I mean, they tend to be called right-wing or nationalist parties or populist parties. In my experience, they tend to be anti-systemic parties. That's what their common thing is, right? Is that they're not touting any particular ideology, whether it's right or not. There's elements of it that are in there. But if you break down what the actual platforms are, a lot of them kind of come down to this system is rotten and we have to break it down. It's very anarchist in a lot of ways, which is actually kind of interesting. And it ends up kind of bringing together lots of different issues and causes, some of which are contradictory to one another. But Alina's right that somehow it kind of like creates some identity that it's us against them. And there's a feeling of disenfranchisement. And I think that maybe that's kind of my long answer, because it's also not an easy fix, is that, so how do you address the issue of mass disenfranchisement? Where did they lose the plot? If you're going back, I remember talking to my colleagues who worked in the Middle East years ago, and they were having a dilemma because as they were trying to encourage youth political participation, youth didn't want to join political parties. They wanted to join movements. They wanted to conduct protests, but they didn't want to get involved in the mechanics, in the institutionalization of the state. And I think that this has kind of been true across the board, that there's a growing inherent distrust in the institutions of states. And that's what's been leading the polarization, I think, right? So I mean, same thing with whether you're looking at the US elections or whether you're looking at the Polish elections, frankly, a lot of it doesn't end up being, there's a degree of some kind of ideology in there, but most of it ends up being that we don't trust the institutions as they are. The institutions as they are have failed us. Therefore, we are disenfranchised as citizens. And so therefore, we have to kind of break them down or take them over in order for them to serve us. But again, societies can't function as simple individuals, that there has to be a collective identity of something that's a baseline, that's an agreement for us all that we need to function. And so what those rules, fundamental rules are. How do you rebuild that? I think is probably the single biggest challenge. And I am not sure that the information bubbles help particularly, but on the other hand, perhaps taking a page out of human history, everything cycles around eventually. And so, probably, the best thing to look at is to try and examine where that moment has been, where you saw the growing distrust in the institutions and what therefore needs to be done to adjust it to make them more responsive to a general public. Understanding that you can't have a referendum and a plebiscite at every single turn, because that is also not practical. But it means that somewhere along the line, there has been such a deep distrust in how the way things run, which I think was taken for granted for a very long time, that you need to step back a little bit to go back to what the basic building blocks of societies are in order to foster some kind of compromise, right? Mm-hmm. Not a perfect answer.
I guess there are no perfect answers, unfortunately. But I was thinking, well, what the three of you ladies have in common is that two of you are permanently based in Brussels. Alina, you've traveled to Brussels on a regular basis and advised decision makers in Brussels. And I was thinking. The immediate challenge in the very near future is going to be that we're very likely going to have a vaccine available. A vaccine which the European Union has negotiated on behalf of member states. And if we are going to have access to it, and if polarization is going to be reduced from that point of view, because somebody in Romania is going to have equal access to this vaccine as somebody who might even be well-to-do in France or in Germany, then that's very much because of the European Union. So I was wondering, since this is going to be a very immediate challenge, how do you make sure that this investment is not lost and that it really reaches its purpose? If you were to advise decision makers in Brussels as to the immediate next steps they absolutely need to take to deal with disinformation, what would that be? It doesn't have to be the complete or perfect answers, but just a few of all the answers out there.
I don't know if you are expecting me to take up this ball, but I'll go ahead. So GLOBSEC has initiated, I'm doing a bit of self-promo, but I think it's totally worth because Romania also has representatives. We have started, in light of the pandemic, a new initiative called Alliance for a Healthy Infosphere, where we work with countries, members of the EU, and with the EU decision makers to find the right policy channels and the messages to work together. I think that one of the issues that we have not seen, and I see it more and more in Brussels, and don't imagine that Brussels is perfect. I mean, at the end of the day, we also have one of the worst number of infection rates in Europe, if not the worst for a long time. I think that what I would advise people at the External Action Service and beyond to do is actually to reach out to national, regional, and local levels. I think that there continues to be a very big disconnect between Brussels and the Brussels dictate, as we keep on seeing it time and again in our GLOBSEC Trends reports, and actually what's happening in every single little town or village, be that in Poland, Latvia, Bulgaria, or even Germany or France. So to me, in order to fight disinformation or an infodemic, either related to vaccine or beyond, I think that we need a whole of a community approach, starting with policymakers on one side, having opinion leaders at the local and national level who are able to communicate, as mentioned, in the local languages, but also who understand the subtleties of cultural and societal traits. Because if we try to compare, I don't know, Transylvania or Moldova with Bârgăoanu or other parts of Europe, we will see that certain things are similar, but actually there are societal differences that play into the way people react or behave in light of new developments. The third thing is what we are missing is European-wide communication strategy. I don't think that we communicate effectively of what the EU is doing, and that's been politicized and instrumentalized for political gains at the local and regional levels. And we could see the cases of Hungary, the cases of Poland, and so on and so forth. And what we did not mention, and I didn't hear the other co-speakers saying, I think that we need to start investing in education and in critical thinking. And this is a very long-term process. And I know we talked about education and changes and adapting our education system to the challenges of today and tomorrow for a long time. But we need to start somewhere developing that type of critical thinking and analysis within our generations, young and not so young, to be able to discern between exactly those identity-driven narratives that are often emotional and that play on fears, but in most of the cases on the perception of fear and of differences. And those who are able to make the difference between what is true, what is a fact, what has happened, and what Joanna also rightly said, that degree of consensus with regards to how we function as a society together. And I will say something maybe even controversial, and that might create further polarization, maybe in the short term, but in the long term, I do believe in prosecution of these things. I don't think that the sense of impunity should be allowed when it comes to disinformation that puts people's lives in danger. And I don't think that there is one in Germany, and we have the example with the denials of Holocaust online and the difference between online and offline when it comes to the Holocaust denial. But I did not see, according to my knowledge, any country in Western Europe or in Europe and the US that put in place a system of reporting and of prosecution that would make sense and that would also act as a deterrence to further spread narratives that have such severe implications for human lives at the end of the day.
Thank you, Alexandra. I am of course waiting for Alina's and Joanna's answers, but let me just throw in one additional question in the mix, because we've been getting it from our own Future Summit social media feed, and that is, how do you educate the elderly? You've mentioned education, Alexandra, but we have one follower who says, my mother and her friends live on Facebook and they only see fake news all day long. So any ideas about how to educate the elderly, not the young?
So if I can answer that, just because I do know of actually like a pretty successful senior literacy program, senior media literacy program. And in a way, it also loops back to your question as to how to deal with the unrolling of the vaccine, right? And the resistance of people to potentially taking something that's going to help this pandemic pass. And the response is relatively not simple, because it is complex, because it actually requires going to members of the community who have authority over the specific group, right? So if you're talking about senior citizens specifically, it is going to where they are. It is going to the community centers, it is going to the care homes, and it is going to the people who work with them day in, day out, but also to the senior citizens themselves, for those who are interested in understanding how media manipulation works. And to have them as being agents to transmit the message farther. So it's low tech, because it's very personal based. So I mean, if you're looking at rolling out an acceptance of the vaccine, it means not only that you have to have the buy-in of the state, obviously with the health ministries and the healthcare workers, but it means that you have to look for those, if you want influencers, but offline influencers in the communities who are authorities in their communities who people do listen to, right? And so I think that that's the difficulty as well, is that this is changing somewhat, but it's going to, I mean, if I were running a country at this point, this is probably the setup that I would be doing right now, right? Is actually kind of like looking down, as far downstream as that I could find, in terms of the influencers who have a direct communication with the community and who are valued and respected in the community, to basically send the message onward. Because hearing something coming from Brussels is easy to ignore. Hearing something coming from, I don't know, your local postal worker who is the main authority in the village telling you that this is a good thing, then that's carries a lot more impact actually, right? And I think that this is a little bit what Alexandra was saying, is that you do have to be very bottom down, and you have to be very aware of what the local society looks like. In terms of dealing with the senior citizens, in the programs that I saw, was actually quite interesting, because again, it's finding those agents who, once they're shown how easily they're being manipulated, actually quite get offended by it and are very quick to tell their friends and neighbors that they're being cheated. So it's actually interesting, right? I mean, the entry point for it was an email scam, right? An email scam of money. And so, but when they were unpacked in terms of like how these things worked, then again, the shock factor was enough that they actually became quite effective agents of change, as they say, right? So I mean, in terms of spreading the word throughout the community. A lot of these things are slow burn. It's much like the education aspect that Alexandra is talking about, critical thinking and all the rest of it. You know, I have an 18-year-old daughter who has lots of opinions, but I have to say, like, the way that she consumes media is somewhat horrifying to me. You know, but it is what it is. On the whole, you know, she's quite well informed, but she's missing a lot of facts. Like, she's missing the attention span to actually like go through a full textbook, as it were, which was part of the course for my generation, at least. So I don't know, the critical thinking I think is good, but it has to be balanced with like a good factual knowledge, which I find a lot of things in modern education tend to skip over. But all of these things I think are part of a very long-term holistic solution.
Can I just take advantage of the fact that you didn't move out of Washington a long time ago? You've only recently moved to Brussels to ask you a follow-up question, which we also got on the social media feed, and that is, how did the Trump truth, or rather post-truth, I would say, how is it going to influence the Biden-Harris presidency? So, in light of what you were saying, and we've already seen President-elect Biden emphasize the coming together, what unites us is stronger than what divides us. How do you expect the Biden administration to go about fixing things, or can they?
I mean, this is my own opinion, not necessarily as a representative of IRI, and also like notably as a foreigner sitting in DC for many years, so a little bit to the side of the circus, as it were. What happened in the States, I think, is actually mirrored in a lot of different countries that I've seen. Maybe it's the scale and the intensity, and because it is the US, and because everybody follows the presidential race as closely as it is, it ends up being that much more dramatic. But no, I don't think that Biden can say anything other than what he is saying, because it's correct ultimately, right? I mean, you do have to come together. You can't continue this. How it goes about doing it, it'll be interesting to see that without the constant drumbeat of divisiveness that we've heard literally day in, day out, in the absence of that coming through official channels, whether that won't somewhat calm the situation a little bit, right? So, I mean, it's not going to fix things necessarily, because I think that that's going to require time, and that's going to take, you know, a difficult look to turn in terms of like how this situation arose in the first place. But in terms of like a first step is at least de-escalating what we have now, and probably bringing in a new administration will be a healthy first step, right? So, I mean, at least if you're not hearing things that are, how'd you say, incredibly aggressive on a daily basis, perhaps that's a good place to start to at least bring the temperature down a little bit in order to look more constructively about moving forward.
Thank you. Alina, any ideas on constructive approaches to countering disinformation?
I am watching this conversation very, very closely, and I'm taking notes. So for me, this is a very, very, very nice conversation, really, and also involving Oana, and also this is a short joke. I'm very glad that this is an all-female panel. I mean, I hope that this doesn't mean that communication is a feminization of communication or of disinformation, because this will be completely wrong. But I'm glad that this is an all-female panel. So there is a lot of solidarity, there is a lot of empathy expressed. So I'm very glad to be part of it. My quick input on media literacy programs for seniors. I think that in the digital space, we are equally vulnerable, because these are changes that have affected pretty much all of us at the same time. So it is not a period that affects only the old people, and where the young people are less vulnerable. In my research about the impact of conspiracy theories at the beginning of pandemic in March, I discovered that the differences regarding the faith in conspiracy theories are not predicted by socio-demographic factors, are not predicted by level of education, but they are predicted by the information menu and by the psychological profile. So in more mundane terms, if you this is what my research showed in March. Maybe right now things are different, but according to my research that I did in March, the level of education does not protect you from believing some sort of very crazy conspiracies that Oana made reference to at the beginning, that the virus is a biological weapon created by Bill Gates, by US in order to reduce the population or to do something evil. It doesn't matter what exactly. So from this point of view, I think that we should have equal attention to all kinds of population, of course, with different messaging and with different channels of engagement. Because this is that was one instance of polarization, including in Romania and I think elsewhere, that this is what that the young people behaving have a certain amount of beliefs, that the senior people are a completely different species on Earth, that they watch mainstream media, but they watch Facebook too much. So I think that was a topic that was weaponized in order to increase polarization. And I think that when addressing the issue of disinformation, we have to be careful with this. So I'm very glad that the topic was brought by one of our viewers. Coming back, Joanna, to your very good question about communication about the COVID-19, about the vaccine. I think what can be done right now is to, first of all, to do some consistent messaging. So probably this will be my first advice. My second piece of advice would be to address the potential risks and the legitimate concerns in a very open manner. I think that if we brand all concerns and all anxieties about the vaccine under conspiracy theory, I think that we make a great mistake. So I think that we should try to differentiate, to discriminate between legitimate concerns and also some crazy stuff, if you allow this kind of wording, some conspiratorial thinking about chips and 5G doing crazy stuff. So consistent messaging is one thing. The second is to address the risks and the potential dangers in a very, very open manner. And the third thing is to acknowledge the thing that there could be errors, that in the pandemic and in general we have limited information and that the situation is dynamic. Let me, for example, you know that one of the first narratives that gained traction all over the European Union at the beginning of the pandemic is that the European Union abandoned its member states and that the member states were left alone. And I remember one of it, you made references to this kind of narrative, and your research showed that it really circulated and it really gained traction in Romania and not only. And I think that one of the best way to address the issue was a very public and very honest acknowledgement by the president of the Euro Commission, by Ursula von der Leyen, that in the beginning that was the case, whether we like it or not. So I think that this type of very open communication, very honest communication, admitting limits and admitting errors helps a lot in fighting disinformation. If the president of the European Commission got stubborn on the idea that the European Union is perfect and has done a great job in solving the pandemic at the beginning, I think that the conspiracy, this kind of conspiratorial narrative would have gained traction even more. But I think probably you remember her speech in front of the European Parliament, in which she apologized in a very, very emotional manner to the Italian people, acknowledging that they were left alone at the beginning of pandemic. So I think that honest communication, honest public communication from governments helps a lot under these circumstances of extreme emotional stress. And if the decision makers get stubborn on this, they stick to their original ideas, we are doing a great job, everything is perfect. This is the perfect type of food, let's say, for the more vocal conspiratorial groups in a society.
Mm-hmm.
Anna, may I just jump into this, because I only partially agree with Alina on that one. And mostly, yes, I think that acknowledging the shortcoming and the lack of solidarity on behalf of the EU at the beginning of the pandemic was the natural and the most normal thing to do. What we saw after on behalf of the EU cannot be just disconsidered. So the efforts of putting together the financial resources, the solidarity, the masks, the ventilators, the getting patients from one country into another to allow health infrastructure to actually survive, it's what matters. I mean, she could show up in front of European Parliament apologizing for our failure, but this is how we turn it around. And this is what I see missing. Not just, or in many countries, we blame or we don't acknowledge that something goes wrong on one hand, but on the other hand, also we don't have the instruments or the tools, or we don't take the necessary actions to prove to the people that we know what we are doing and they will feel protected. And those fears with regards to the virus, the pandemic, can be actually minimized because we have it under control. So I think that that's another part of the story that is very important to mention with regards to the political elites in principle.
Mm-hmm. This is a very useful add-on to what I've just said. So thank you very much for this.
And Alexandra, can I come back to you and change tack completely in a way, because we also have a question that looks to another very complicated issue, and that is very technologically intensive, deep fakes. And the question is, what do you think of deep fakes 5 years from now? Are they going to start a war because somebody is going to think, a state is going to get an alarm signal that it's being attacked because somebody managed to put this into their cyber systems? Are we going to believe even wilder narratives, toxic narratives, because we were going to see videos that we're not going to know are not real? What do you think is going to happen?
One of my favorite topics. I think that technological advancement won't be stopped, and we should not stop it. It leads to change and it leads to development. That's my very firm belief. What we will need to do as societies is to have an objective oversight of where this technology goes and what is the dual use of this technology, because they're designed for a specific purpose and then they are misused, like the case of deepfakes, but also biodata and so on and so forth. So I think that this is the big challenge of agreeing on how that oversight, be that legal, regulatory, ethical, would look like. Deepfakes will continue to become even more accurate. I think that we will see even new instruments that we cannot even think of that are already in the development phase or in the trial phases. And it's normal to fear that this will bring even more chaos, polarization, and distrust, and likely some of them will. However, I personally don't think that that will lead to war. It will lead to conflict, but conflict could be active and violent, or it could be the regular conflict that actually makes societies progress, and those are good. I am more afraid of different type of technological tools that will have offensive capabilities that will be able to start by choice or as a side casualty, a conflict, be that a large scale or a smaller scale. And cyber being one of them, hijacking of civilian critical infrastructure such as dams or hydropower, nuclear centrals, and so on and so forth. And then would be one of the topics that I'm currently looking at, and there is not much around as I discover, is how exactly the social biases and the conflict biases and the grievances in countries that are already in conflict in a form or shape are actually then transferred into these algorithm biases, how non-state actors are able to radicalize people that did not necessarily have an inclination to take up arms against someone else. So I'm much more afraid of this type of instruments, offensive capabilities, dual-use technologies that we are designing without taking into account what that other use would be. With deepfakes, I think that they will create some political tensions, and we will see that, especially when those are attributed to various leaders, especially where there are growing tensions at the international level. But deepfakes in particular, I don't think that they will be. We will have the capabilities of actually, and we do have capabilities of discerning at the military and intelligence level what is a deepfake and what has been actually manipulated and what is real imagery. We have issues with countering other type of offensive tools and how the future will look like in terms of weaponry and military capabilities development.
And since we got to the topic of war and conflict, I realized we really haven't spoken much about the role of third-party actors. You know, most often, I think until the pandemic struck, it was mostly Russia and China that were drawing most of the attention when it came to disinformation. I think that we've gradually moved to recognize that a lot of that is just domestic production. But I would like to ask you, where do you think these third-party actors stand? Are they the ones initiating disinformation, funding it, advancing these toxic narratives, and then spreading them throughout our societies through agents of influence and useful idiots? Or are they at the receiving end, rather just benefiting and opportunistically using the narratives that are circulating in our societies already because of all the vulnerabilities, the polarization, the breakdown of dialogue that's been mentioned here? Where do external powers stand in relation to what the US terminology is? I think it's very interesting that they call that entrenched part of society that tends to believe and buy into all these narratives, the domestic adversary, which is a controversial term, but it shows just how strong these influences are. Any ideas on this?
So if I can, so I think both is the answer, unfortunately, right? I mean, there's been enough studies to demonstrate how foreign influences have worked, right? And you can see that, you know, in terms of when this conversation began several years ago, like clearly there was an acute awareness of Russia's involvement in troll farms and all of this kind of stuff, right? And I don't think it would be naive to think that it's all gone away. Like that's not the case. I think it's a lot quieter than it has been, and it's also can't be overemphasized because frankly, yes, I think there's a growing awareness of how much more dangerous and effective the organic disinformation is, right? And whether it's, you know, useful idiots or whether it's political actors looking to score their own goals on a domestic level, it doesn't really matter, right? It still creates like this information slush that doesn't do anybody much good. You know, there is growing evidence and growing studies about, you know, China, frankly, upping its disinformation game. It's not something that was necessarily part of its active arsenal, or they were, the Chinese were a little bit ham-handed in terms of these kinds of operations, and they have taken a page from Russia, right? That they have become more nuanced and subtle in this, but I still would not overemphasize that, right? I think that in all of these cases, they still take advantage of domestic vulnerabilities ultimately, right? So, I mean, you can't manufacture a problem out of thin air. It's generally somehow linked with a very real domestic issue and that. But I mean, you know, in terms of it's going to remain an issue, I think, just because that there are political aims for both of these actors in the longer term. But I think that you have to be careful about how you expend your energies in terms of countering them, right? I mean, there's only so much that you can do in terms of trying to remain a step ahead that basically, has to belie a very deep knowledge of what foreign policy goals are in any particular moment, and so therefore what kind of campaign they're willing to run in order to meet those ends. And it's still probably in the longer term more beneficial for all of the reasons that we've talked about previously, of focusing on building the domestic resilience and improving our own homes, basically, to become more safe and more consequently less susceptible to external influences.
Mm-hmm. Ciprian is lurking in the dark somewhere on the internet, and for the sake of gender balance, I'm going to pass it to him because I know he has some questions as well. So
thank you.
Ciprian,
I'm lurking.
by all the women.
I will remember this for all, the rest of my life, when I was lurking on the dark sides of internet. I have a question for all of you. It's a game, actually. So the game starts like this. Can you please, each one of you, tell me one a politician that is active and living from outside of Romania, so that we get this more global. So it can be, as global as you want. So let's pick up a politician. Oana?
Just any politician.
Any politician, yes. You can like him or her, you can hate him or her, it doesn't matter.
Okay. Marcel Ciolacu, PSD. Oh, sorry, outside of Romania.
Let's focus on let's move out of this country for a second and.
Emmanuel Macron.
Macron, okay, Alexandra.
And Oana, that was my choice, given my half, my better half.
The choice of many.
Okay, I'll go for Angela Merkel.
Merkel,
oh,
okay.
No, I cannot believe it. Really, I mean, that was my choice. I mean, what?
So, next. Okay, so we have Macron, Merkel.
Joanna, can I go first before you? So my first choice was Angela Merkel. But I will switch to Obama.
Obama, okay, and the last but not least?
Well, so you've all picked, I was going to say Justin Trudeau because that's my other passport. So,
okay,
but then you kind of have people who are all somewhat eerily similar. But okay, all right, I'll say Justin Trudeau.
Okay, Trudeau. So three men and one woman. That's a good. That's an interesting point. First point. So let's imagine you have a conversation, each of you, with your selected politician. Can you tell us what question would you ask this politician related to fake news and disinformation, and how? So that's the first part of the question, the imaginary question. So Oana, what would you ask Mr. Emmanuel Macron about fake news and disinformation?
My questions would be way too technical, I think, because France has an interesting record in dealing with disinformation. He was personally the target of a lot of disinformation ahead of the election that he won. So France has actually activated a lot of mechanisms of making sure that this would not overturn the final result of the election, will not influence it. So my questions would be very technical, how they did it, if they think it could apply in other contexts, because it's very intelligence driven and security driven. It has very little to do with contributing to the improvement of power of public debate and so on and so forth. It's more of a security approach. So I would just be curious about that.
I'll ask.
Boring.
I will ask him, of course. No, yeah. So let's continue. Merkel, please. Bitte.
For Chancellor Merkel, I think that one of the questions that I would be very interested is about the disinformation narratives around the refugees and the migration crisis, knowing that Germany was the country that took the largest portion or the largest number of refugees. And at the end of the day, we talk about 1 or 2 million. And I would just ask, how did they did it? How did they do it? And whether or not they still see divisive narratives or polarization within German societies when it comes to the acceptance of refugees in Germany.
Cool. I don't think I can reach her, but we'll ask Macron the same one as well. Alina?
I would ask President Obama what would be his first action in order to convince Americans to believe in facts and in experts, to trust facts and experts, and more precisely expert-based institutions. So not experts as individuals, but expert-based institutions. And whether he has a responsibility related to his term as a president.
Good point, yeah. Joanna, we go a bit north now.
A bit north, I mean, so I would ask how he deals with the common information space, right? I mean, that's always been the challenge, that like linguistically, culturally, I would say that we're a little bit different, right? But I mean, we share the same media space to a large extent, and we certainly share the same social media space. And so even if you have groups that are operating in the US space, it does bleed over, right, into ours, and it does end up impacting Canadian politics. So what do you do, and how do you handle that?
Yep. So in this game of questions, the second part of the game, I will kindly ask Alexandra, Alina, and Joanna to prepare a very short question to Oana.
Hey, I didn't know this. This
so
is
who wants to
changing.
go? Who wants to shoot
game.
first? Of course, on the topic, not on anything else. Alexandra, a question on disinformation.
I'm happy to go first, as I've been long enough outside Romania to be able to be politically more acid, maybe. You've been in public service, and maybe one day you'll go back to public service. So imagine that you work either in parliament or for the president of Romania. What would be your top policy choice in dealing with the social polarization in Romania and countering the disinformation?
Good. So we have one question.
Country?
One question. Alina, your question.
How would you engage a middle-aged woman from the countryside with deep religious beliefs to get the vaccine against COVID?
Easy questions, I mean.
This is not, I mean, that was very evil from me. I mean, no.
Yes. Joanna, you can be even more evil if you want.
That's not fair. I mean, I guess my question is, what do you think is the single biggest lesson that Romania can take from looking at some of the other examples? And I have to apologize to you all in advance, and I'm taking this advantage now because I have to leave very strictly in 5 minutes.
We do have 2 minutes left.
And my battery is dying out, so thank you very much for all these questions. It's been a pleasure. I'm kidding. But very, very quickly, Alexandra, to your question, no, there's not just one policy that can address social polarization in Romania. It's socioeconomic polarization, so it's a complex of measures, really. But I think one very important thing that I think many governments have not understood is that the reason the Social Democrat government in Romania, for instance, is traditionally so popular is that it distributes the so-called subsidies more generously. And of course, this is a strategy to be able to collect more votes from those parts of the population that are more dependent on the state. But then on the other hand, that's what people want. They need to feel that their quality of living improves today, not tomorrow or 1 week from now or 1 year from now. So you absolutely need to deliver some benefit to those parts of society that feel more disenfranchised. And this is not going against austerity measures. This is just kind of improving consumer confidence, if you want. So that's one thing. Alina, to your question, it's very simple, and it's been mentioned here. Influencers in the community, you have to approach people speaking their language, starting from their concerns, knowing them, understanding the dynamics at local level. So get people to speak to them who who actually come from the same background or understand the background, and they're regarded as influential figures. So that's not me. I think I'm a city girl. I have many shortcomings that would not make me the best candidate to go out and do that. And
to go to the local priest to convince him to join you.
That is a personal ambition, to actually engage with the church, and if I ever manage to do that, I will absolutely let you know. And Joanna, to your question, I think that was what's the one lesson that Romania can kind of import from other countries. I'm not sure. I think there are actually many, because we haven't been so active in trying to counter disinformation and malign influence. I think there is stuff that we can learn from the regulatory approach in Germany and France. But there's also a lot of stuff that we can learn from the Scandinavian countries in terms of improving resilience by activating the local communities and local authorities. There's lots that we can learn from the Baltics, from the way they've been dealing with this for many, many years. So I think we actually need to look 360 degrees around us, and there's a wealth of experience out there that we haven't even started to learn yet.
Good. It was a great session. Thank you very much. I feel I feel more informed. I wanted to play with the word disinformation, but it doesn't really work.